Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely. Always up for a good deep dive.
Awesome. So today, we're going to be tackling indigenous rights,
Great topic.
but not just the theory.
Yeah.
We really want to get into how these rights actually play out in the real world.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the actual implementation.
Yeah, for sure.
So we're going to be looking at an excerpt from a keynote speech by Megan Davis.
Oh, excellent choice.
Yeah, she's incredible legal scholar and advocate for indigenous rights.
Uh,
And this speech was delivered at the NACCH Parliamentary Breakfast back in 2013.
okay.
And I think you'll find it's really insightful.
Well, one of the things that always strikes me about Davis's work is that she's so good at cutting through the noise and getting to the heart of the matter. She doesn't shy away from the tough questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Like in this speech, she really highlights this disconnect that often exists between international laws that are supposed to protect indigenous rights and the realities that indigenous communities are actually facing.
Right. It's like we have all these big declarations about human rights, but how do those words translate into tangible change in people's lives?
Exactly.
It's almost like having a textbook and trying to solve a real world problem.
Yeah.
Like the theory's there, but you need practical tools to actually get things done.
Exactly. And one of the frameworks Davis tackles head on in this speech is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
The UNDRIP.
Yes, the UNDRIP. It's this landmark document, but there's so much debate around it because it's non-binding,
Right.
meaning governments aren't legally obligated to uphold it.
So it's like kind of a strongly worded suggestion.
Well, yeah, in a sense.
I could see why there'd be some skepticism around that, especially after, generations of broken promises and policies that haven't always served indigenous communities well.
And Davis acknowledges that skepticism, but she argues that getting bogged down in the binding versus non-binding debate can actually distract from the real work of implementing these rights.
Oh, interesting.
And she even points out this irony. You know how crucial international law has been for advancing indigenous rights here in Australia?
Oh, yeah.
Like the Racial Discrimination Act of 1975, it played a key role in, landmark cases like the Mabo litigation, which recognized native title for the first time.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like sometimes actions speak louder than words, even when those words are, enshrined in these international declarations.
Absolutely.
So how does Davis propose we bridge this gap,
hmm
between the ideals of human rights and the reality on the ground?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Davis's work with NSCCHO provides a compelling model.
Ah, NSCCO.
Yeah.
For those who might not be familiar, NSCCHO is the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organization.
Right.
And they represent this huge network of like over 150 Aboriginal community controlled health services across Australia.
hmm
They're all about empowering those communities to take charge of their own healthcare.
And Davis really highlights their work, like both within Australia and on the international stage, as this prime example of how Indigenous communities can lead the way in implementing the UNDRIP.
So instead of waiting for governments to take the reins, they're stepping up and saying, hey, this is what self-determination looks like in action. It's
Exactly.
like flipping the script on centuries of colonial control.
Precisely. And to understand, the power of this approach, it's crucial to consider the historical context for Australia's Indigenous peoples.
Right.
For generations, they've experienced these policies designed to control and assimilate them,
Mm-hmm.
stripping away their autonomy, their decision-making power. A stark example of this is the protection era.
Oh, yeah.
That period in Australian history when the government basically exerted control over almost every aspect of Indigenous lives,
Right.
from where they could live to who they could marry.
It's heartbreaking to think about the impact of those policies. No wonder the right to self-determination emerged as such a powerful aspiration for Indigenous communities.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming that power,
Yeah.
the power to shape their own lives and futures, free from external control.
So let's talk about self-determination in a practical sense. I mean, Davis argues that the very word has been almost wiped out of Australian political discourse.
Yeah, it's been demonized and dismissed as this, failed experiment,
Wow.
which really contrasts with how other countries, with large indigenous populations like the US, Canada, New Zealand, how they approach it.
Okay.
They readily acknowledge and incorporate self-determination into their policies.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real disconnect there.
Definitely.
But Davis insists that despite this political pushback, the desire for self-determination, it remains this driving force within those communities.
Absolutely. And she sees community control as this tangible way to put this principle into action.
And here's where Davis's work with Enalzi becomes really relevant, right?
Yes. She points to the Aboriginal community-controlled health services sector as this powerful example of what community control looks like on the ground.
So what exactly does community control look like in practice? I mean, it sounds like a really important concept, but I'm curious to know how it plays out in a tangible way.
Well, Davis provides this pretty clear definition. It's about communities having control over issues that directly affect them, especially when it comes to those essential services,
Right.
healthcare, education, and social support.
It's about giving those communities a voice and a seat at the table when it comes to decisions that shape their lives.
Precisely. And she uses Anatio's membership criteria as this really concrete illustration.
Oh, okay.
So to be a member, those health services have to be initiated and governed by the local Aboriginal community.
Interesting.
Like they need to be rooted in the community itself and delivering services that are holistic and culturally appropriate.
So it's all about shifting those power dynamics, putting the community in the driver's seat.
Exactly.
And it's not just some idealistic notion, right?
Yeah.
Davis points to the real-world success of NDAVO in improving health outcomes for Indigenous Australians as proof that this model actually works.
Yes. She highlights their 2013 report card, which demonstrated that community-controlled health services were achieving these significantly better outcomes for things like child and maternal health, chronic disease management, mental health care, compared to mainstream services.
Wow.
And these weren't just small improvements. They were substantial gains directly attributable to that community control model.
That's impressive. So it sounds like community control isn't just about feel-good empowerment. It's about, tangible, measurable progress.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that this concept of community control extends beyond just the health sector. It reflects a much broader movement within Indigenous communities to reclaim their agency and take ownership of their destinies.
So we've got this powerful idea of community control as a way to put self-determination into action. But how does it play out in other areas beyond health?
Well, this is where Davis brings in the perspective of another prominent Indigenous leader, Noel Pearson,
Okay.
and his critique of what he calls the tyranny of distance.
Tyranny of distance. Okay, tell me more about that. It sounds intriguing.
So Pearson was arguing that the further removed decision-making is from the people it affects, the less effective and impactful those decisions become. He was particularly concerned about the growing bureaucracy in Indigenous affairs and how it was sidelining Indigenous-led organizations.
It sounds like he's echoing Davis's point about the need to shift power dynamics and give Indigenous communities more control over their own affairs.
Exactly. Pearson felt that this trend toward bureaucratic top-down approaches was actually hindering progress,
Okay.
creating this kind of tyranny of distance that prevented true empowerment and self-determination.
Interesting.
He felt that true, lasting progress could only come from within Indigenous communities themselves. He even used the term junior partner to describe the ideal relationship between the government and Indigenous communities.
Oh, interesting.
He was basically saying the government needed to trust and empower Indigenous communities to take the lead, rather than trying to dictate solutions from afar.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's easy to see how well-intentioned policies can totally miss the mark if they're not grounded in the lived experience and knowledge of the communities they're supposed to serve.
Right.
It's like trying to navigate a city with a map that's outdated or incomplete. You might end up getting lost or missing crucial landmarks.
That's a great analogy. And Pearson argued that this over-reliance on bureaucracy and outside experts was actually undermining the very organizations and leaders best equipped to drive meaningful change.
So instead of empowering Indigenous communities, these top-down approaches were actually disempowering them.
That was his point. He was a strong advocate for investing and strengthening Indigenous-led organizations because he recognized their unique understanding of community needs and their proven ability to deliver effective solutions.
And this is where Davis's work with the NACHO becomes even more relevant, right? It's a real-world example of how that community control can actually lead to better outcomes.
Absolutely. Davis highlights NACHO's success as evidence that, community control isn't just some theoretical concept. It's a model that gets results. She cites the report card again, specifically mentioning how their community-controlled health services were making significant strides in areas like child mortality rates, which had been a persistent and heartbreaking issue.
Yeah, it's so powerful to see how community control can translate into real life-changing improvements for people. It's not just about these abstract rights. It's about tangible progress on issues that matter deeply.
And Davis doesn't just highlight the big picture wins. She digs into the specific mechanisms that make community control so effective. She talks about how NHO ensures deep community engagement through things like their 10-point plan, which was developed in consultation with their member organizations across the country, and their annual members meeting, where representatives from those community-controlled health services all come together to share their experiences, set priorities, and hold each other accountable.
It sounds like they've created a truly collaborative and responsive system, one that's built on trust and mutual respect.
That's exactly the kind of environment that Pearson believed was essential for sustainable progress. He argued that instead of dictating solutions, governments should focus on providing resources and support, acting as a true partner to Indigenous communities rather than trying to control or manage them.
So putting this all together, it seems like Davis and Pearson are both advocating for this fundamental shift in how we approach Indigenous affairs.
Yeah.
Moving away from this top-down bureaucratic model
Right.
toward one that prioritizes Indigenous leadership and self-determination through community control.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing the inherent strengths and capabilities of Indigenous communities and supporting them to lead the way.
It sounds like a much more respectful and potentially far more effective approach.
And here's where it gets even more interesting, because this idea of community control isn't just relevant to Indigenous rights. It has these broader implications for how we address social issues as a whole.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that. How does this connect to the bigger picture?
Well, think about it this way. Community-driven solutions, where the people most affected by a problem are empowered to be part of the solution, have the potential to be far more effective and sustainable than these top-down approaches.
It makes sense. Who better to understand the nuances of a challenge and come up with innovative solutions than the people who are experiencing it firsthand?
Exactly. It's about tapping into the wisdom and knowledge that exists within communities, recognizing that they often have the best insights into what works and what doesn't.
It's like the difference between trying to fix a leaky faucet yourself versus calling in a plumber who's seen hundreds of leaky faucets and knows exactly what to do.
Perfect analogy. And it's not just about practical expertise, it's about ownership and accountability. When communities are invested in finding solutions, they're more likely to stick with them and see them through.
So it's not just about empowering communities, it's about creating a system where everyone has a stake in success.
Precisely. And this resonates with Davis's call to put meat on the bones of those abstract human rights declarations. It's about translating those lofty ideals into tangible actions and sustainable change.
That phrase really struck me, putting meat on the bones. It's so evocative. It's like taking a skeletal framework and building something real and substantial around it.
Exactly. And that's what community control is all about, taking those fundamental rights like self-determination and participation and building a system where those rights are exercised in a meaningful and impactful way.
It sounds like Davis is urging us all to think differently about how we can contribute to creating a more just and equitable society, one where communities are empowered to shape their own destinies.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's inspiring to see how these ideas can ripple outwards, impacting not just Indigenous communities, but potentially influencing the way we approach social change in all sorts of contexts.
Right. And it challenges us to think critically about where power resides in our systems and how we can shift those dynamics to create more, equitable and effective solutions.
Davis's speech really leaves us with a lot to ponder. It's not just about understanding the legal frameworks or the theoretical concepts.
Yeah.
It's about grappling with those real-world implications and asking ourselves how we can be a part of positive change.
And she reminds us that these aren't just issues for policymakers or academics to solve.
Yeah.
They're issues that affect all of us, and we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What resonated most with you from Davis's speech?
For me, it's that powerful image of putting meat on the bones of human rights.
Yeah.
It's this reminder that those rights are meaningless unless they're translated into tangible improvements in people's lives. And community control, as exemplified by the work of Naturais, offers this really compelling model for how to do just that.
I completely agree. It's so easy to get caught up in those abstract debates and legal complexities, but Davis brings it back to the human element. It's about empowering communities to take ownership of their futures and create the kind of world they want to live in.
And she challenges us to move beyond passive observation.
Yeah.
It's not enough to simply acknowledge the injustices of the past or the challenges of the present. We need to be actively engaged in finding solutions and supporting initiatives that promote self-determination and community control.
So as we leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question, what steps can each of us take to support and empower Indigenous-led initiatives in our own communities? How can we contribute to creating a future where those principles of self-determination and community control become a reality for all Indigenous peoples?
It's a question worth reflecting on. It might involve supporting Indigenous-owned businesses, advocating for policy changes, or simply educating ourselves and others about the issues. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to building a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it sparked some new ideas and inspired you to learn more about the incredible work being done by Indigenous communities all around the world.
Until next time, keep diving deep, keep questioning, and keep believing in the power of community to create positive change.